matter what your opinion on Rose Quartz is, I think that most people would agree that the character makes for a very interesting topic to discuss. And while the topic of this debate tends to be focused on her decision to fight for Earth, I think that people sometimes gloss over what the show deems to be the most important period of her life, and the first part of her character that we learn about, her time with Greg, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through each of the 3 Greg and Rose episodes, as well as a handful of moments about the pair from other quarter hours, as we break down both arguably the most important relationship in the show, as well as one of my favorite parts of the franchise.
Oh, you're wearing the shirt.
Especially in comparison to the next episode I'm going to talk about, Story for Steven is very focused on establishing the facts of Greg and Rose's relationship rather than the actual feelings occurring. As Rose has maybe 2 lines of any actual significance, and a good chunk of the quarter hour, including its catchy opening song, is more focused on developing the idea of a young, struggling rock star Greg, complete with his infinitely entertaining scumbag of a manager, Marty. Speaking of that opening song, while Comet might not be about Rose, I do think that it's worth discussing, as it gives us a little bit of insight into Greg's mindset right before meeting her, as he sings about trying to find purpose through becoming this ultra-famous rock star, rocketing through the cosmos to try and find his place, only for the camera to pan out and reveal that his dreams haven't quite been realized. At least for the next 2 or 3 seconds, as we get our first interaction in between this video's title characters. As I go through each conversation between Greg and Rose in this video, I think it's important to keep in mind where each one of them is mentally at when it comes to the other. Something that fortunately doesn't change much in this episode, as Greg stays pretty consistently smitten and Rose stays pretty consistently amused. This is something that is seen pretty clearly even in just this first scene, as Greg fails to keep himself composed with the 8-foot pink goddess in front of him, as she mostly just laughs at his ironic space gimmicks. This is something that continues as he chases her back to the temple, as in between a jealous Pearl delivering the best jokes of the episode,
I can sing.
It's a lot more of these characters just seeing each other on a surface level, as Rose cracks jokes about his space train to the cosmos, and Greg forgets entirely about the outside world. Ultimately, despite this episode's premise, it's really more about Greg, with its biggest moment coming when he ditches Marty. Something that, while related to Rose, was more about him becoming generally disenchanted with the rock and roll life he had been promised. But there is one more interaction between this pair, short enough that I can fit the entirety of it on screen, and dense enough that I'm gonna spend a minute or 2 talking about it. Starting with the significantly less catchy and equally more meaningful second song of the episode, Destiny. While this song does contain a bit of Greg's attempts to keep the suave Mr. Universe brand intact, it's just a much more vulnerable tune than Comet, as he sings of Rose's control over him. Control that he simply just can't understand. This then continues into the conversation that follows, as he barely hears any of what she's saying, instead deciding to communicate that, after he just left his manager on the side of the road, that Rose has become pretty much his entire world. On the other side of this conversation, after hearing all of this, and knowing that Greg had important plans before randomly showing back up, Rose immediately realizes the damage that she's potentially causing to his life, deciding to attempt a little bit of damage control. This line in particular, which is perhaps the only genuine moment from Rose in this one, is easily the most interesting of the entire episode, as she describes spending time with Greg as quote-unquote playing with him, fairly understanding that it's unfair for her to knowingly allow him to waste his short life vying for the attention of an immortal who believes that she's had similar attractions to dozens of humans before. Something that the fact that she was still wearing his shirt after saying goodbye may argue with. Overall, Story for Steven feels like a storybook type of tale, and one without much depth, as we end with our two characters pretty much knowing nothing about each other. 3 things that cannot be said about the following Greg and Rose outing.
You're adorable, Mr. Universe. See you later.
Bye.
Before getting into We Need to Talk, I feel like it's only fair to mention that, out of all 150 plus episodes of this show that I love so dearly, this quarter hour is perhaps my favorite, and quite easily so if you don't include Future. Generally, when I write these videos that aren't explicitly reviews, I really try to keep them about 70% analysis, something that's gonna be pretty hard with this one. Anyway, before getting into the actual Rose and Greg story, I think it's important to mention why Greg is bringing the story up to Steven in the first place, being that he just discovered his son's ability to fuse with Connie. Something first reflected in this tale ostensibly being about fusion, but more so in it being about Greg's ability to finally bridge the gem-human gap. Something he hopes that Connie can learn from. There's also this really interesting bit at the end of the episode where Greg seemingly and accidentally classifies his son as more gem than human, but to actually get to the topic of this video, we open up to one of my favorite songs to ever come out of this franchise, and by far the best lyrical breakdown of Greg and Rose, What Can I Do For You? Despite the fact that this song is a solid 2/3 chorus and has a fantastic guitar solo for a good chunk of the runtime, this one is actually pretty lyrically dense, including in ways like the fact that the chorus also works from Pearl's perspective that I'm not even gonna get into. Speaking of the chorus, let's start by breaking down the part of the song from both singers, as they sing about the oddity of their relationship, wondering what they can do to differentiate themselves from the other's past partners. This is something that applies a bit more to the human half of the relationship, as while Greg's chances of getting with another gem are pretty slight, he's seemingly very aware, or is at least about to become very aware, that he's not Rose's first human being, desperately trying to remain her last. Speaking of Rose, her verse on this song shares her confusion towards her developing feelings towards Greg, something that, for the time being, she's classifying as just a supercharged version of her normal pro-human emotions. Towards the end of the episode, Rose will reveal to Greg that she's never been quote-unquote in love with a human. And to the chagrin of Pearl, this likely expands to all other beings as well. Something that recontextualizes her lyrics here to her misunderstanding her feelings for Greg and seeing them as her simply finding him more entertaining than the average human. A belief that she carries into her conversation with Greg at the end of the episode. Before then though, and because of a hilariously jealous yet stunningly kick-ass display of fusion by Pearl, Greg gets it in his head that he needs to fuse with Rose in order to make their relationship actually real. Something that Amethyst and Garnet both tell him that they believe is possible, although with different goals in mind, with the former just wanting a laugh and the latter actually wanting to help. After a quick pep talk from the Everlasting Fusion, where Garnet tells him that his only chance to fuse is to do it his way, Greg begins his plan, setting up for Rose a night of dancing under the stars, perfectly capped by him elegantly leading her to a conveniently placed step, using their now similar heights to kiss, only for it to not end in fusion. This is something that is prevalent throughout most of this interaction, but just to make it easier to see what I'm talking about, I'm going to just reference the frame that is currently on screen, which is coincidentally one of my favorite shots in the show. Besides the litany of things in the shot that are just visually great, what I really want to focus on is, despite the fact that Greg has built himself a platform in an attempt to get to her level, there's seemingly just nothing he can do so that she's not looking down on him. She'll always see him as something less, he'll always see her as something more, and they both know it. Well, they at least both think it. Back to the conversation, when Greg brings up fusion, Rose can't help but laugh, both at the absurdity of his idea and in an attempt to avoid the tougher conversation. A conversation that Greg then forces by asking Rose to talk to him like a real person, something that, for more reasons than one, she really can't do. This final conversation between the pair, besides just featuring what is arguably some of the strongest writing in the show, also highlights both Greg and Rose finally accepting that their relationship is unlike anything that any other being has ever experienced, and that the way to properly handle it is not just to pretend that that isn't the case. There's also an attempt here for the pair to actually connect to each other beyond just their surface persona, as while Rose does refer to Mr. Universe by his actual name, she also neglects to answer any of his questions about her background, perhaps in an attempt to not have to lie to him like she has to Amethyst and Garnet, but we'll circle back to that towards the end of the video. Finally, this conversation ends with a few lines that this video's title references, as Greg defines the difference between loving someone and being in love with someone as torture, a concept that a war-experienced Rose simply can't wrap her head around. Obviously, there's a bit of a Starfire-esque alien not understanding human figurative language stuff going on here, but I think the more interesting part of this is, as her verse in the episode's song indicated, Rose just doesn't know what being in love means, trying to explain that feeling as a supercharged version of what she felt with other humans, whereas Greg sees it as the type of love that transcends simple enjoyment and allows harder questions to seep in. Questions that this episode doesn't attempt to answer, instead deciding to end with our pair happily dancing after deciding to tackle them together. Of course, as Garnet makes pretty clear to the viewer, this is the closest that Rose and Greg can come to fusing, as they finally actually get on the same page, coming together as one to face the future. This is a really weird episode. Obviously, this video still has like 10 more quarter hours of varying degrees to talk about or whatever, but I think that you can make the argument that this is the only episode in the series that shows any real change in Rose and Greg's relationship from both sides, as they realize that what they have is serious and that they have to start treating it as such. A development that leads to the much healthier couple that we see in every subsequent appearance. And while there are a bunch of things that cause me to love this episode as much as I do, from the terrific song to the out-of-this-world visuals to the great pearl jabs and Steven retrospection, there's just nothing that compares to the writing, as the show explores this cross-species relationship in a way that feels like it respects the weirdness of it all while also making it feel immensely human. Rose Quartz is a character that, in the seasons to follow, will become immensely complex. But at this moment, at least to Greg, none of that matters as much as the time they're spending together right now. While there is a lot more that you could potentially derive from this episode, including the possibility of the illusion that the pair achieved a different type of fusion that Greg didn't feel comfortable sharing with Steven and Connie, I think the episode ultimately has one goal: to show these two characters who, at least relative to their lifespans, just finished the action-packed part of their lives, and are ready to settle down with no real idea of how to do so, only knowing that they're going to do it together, setting up both everything that we already know about this pair's existence and everything that's left to learn.
Oh man, I am a baby.
Do you want to get down?
Yeah.
Greg the Babysitter is the final of the 3 flashback episodes featuring extended looks at Greg and Rose during this period. And despite everybody having the same design, it's pretty clear that there's been a pretty significant time jump, as the pair just seems significantly healthier than they were in their last appearance, as if their decision to try and actually work things out actually took. Perhaps a bit too well. While We Need to Talk is clearly about both parties, and arguably mostly Rose, needing to make some changes in order to make their relationship actually last, this episode, as perfectly described in the infinitely catchy I Think I Need a Little Change, is mostly about Greg needing to actually grow up, including in his relationship with Rose, but also every other part of his life. Given this video's topic, I'm obviously going to focus on the parts of this episode about his relationship with Rose, but if you want a more general look at Greg's journey in this one, and how it reflects on his son's journey throughout the show, I did a video on it about 6 months ago. Anyway, despite the opening song being directed towards Rose, it's actually not the lyrics, which mostly just describe how much Greg loves spending time with her, that I want to focus on. Rather, it's the fact that in nearly every clip, Rose is treating Greg more like a kid and less like a boyfriend. And while some of this is just related to the size difference between the pair, there's also stuff like the fact that he just sits around and waits for her to come back from work, as well as the fact that, as we see at the end of the episode, Rose has the same approach towards Greg as one would have towards a child, allowing him to face a little bit of danger before stepping in to prevent serious injury. Throughout the episode, all of this builds to get across the general idea that Greg can't continue to live this way, something that he remedies at the end of the episode by getting his iconic car washing gig, realizing that he's not betraying Rose by getting another responsibility, and that it's really the only way that he could continue to see her long term. But that's not all of the Rose and Greg stuff in this episode, as I kinda skipped past the title baby, Sour Cream, who spends the entire quarter hour enamoring Rose. And while this mostly transpires in cute little interactions, we also get this monologue from Rose, in yet another example of some of my favorite writing of the show, as she continues her love of change first expressed in the tape from Lion 3. And while a good chunk of this reflects on both her hidden past of massive changes, as well as the growing up that Greg is about to do, it's hard to not see it as just adoration of the human condition, and the ability for anybody at any time to invent or reinvent themselves. Obviously, as seen in every episode I've talked about in this video, Rose has a deep fascination with human beings, but I don't think that it's ever put in clearer terms than it is here, as she describes the entity in front of her as if it's worth giving up everything in order to create. And this is the final chronological appearance of a non-pregnant Rose Quartz. Dramatic line aside, there obviously is a bit of a gap in between appearances, but the next time that we see Rose Quartz, which also happens to be the first time that we see Rose Quartz, she's recording a tape of her and Greg adorably hanging out, talking about how happy she is to be bringing Steven/Nora into the world, and allowing them to experience the human ability to grow that she adores so much. Obviously, this tape is already pretty short, and is rightfully filled with Rose gut punch after gut punch, but they do find the time to fit in a couple of great interactions between these two characters, showing that they weren't going to let grief for what was to come ruin their last few months together. And somewhat unfortunately, these 5 episodes make up every piece of Rose and Greg's story that was animated in the show. Something that, while not ideal, I kind of understand. In the final 2 seasons of the show, as well as future, for reasons that I don't want to fully get into, it just simply wouldn't make sense to have a feel-good Rose Quartz story. And I'd much rather have things end here, rather than an episode that showed a less favorable view of this couple. However, as as you can probably tell by the fact that this video isn't over, just because one half of this video's title pair ceases to exist after this point, that doesn't mean that the other half has completely moved on.
So let me drive my van into your heart. Let me drive my van into your heart.
Somewhat surprisingly, there's really not a single episode that solely focuses on Greg and Rose after the latter's death, as Greg is seemingly mostly past it by the time we first meet him. Obviously, he still has moments of grief, as I'll spend the rest of this section talking about, but in what I'd guess was probably an attempt to highlight how grief is affecting Pearl in such a greater way, given how inconsequential 14 years is to her in comparison to it being close to a third of Greg's life that he's now spent as a single parent. Despite this, we do get one episode that still shows Greg dealing pretty heavily with the conflicting emotions of having a son and losing his mother at the same time, which comes a few months after Rose's death in the form of the final young-ish Greg outing, 3 gems and a baby. And while a good chunk of this Christmas episode ultimately ends up being more about the gems learning to deal with the fact that Rose is not Steven, trapped in Steven, or fused within Steven, there are a few moments here where we get to see a Greg who's not yet 14 years removed from Rose's passing, and he's quite predictably struggling quite a bit. And while he does keep it somewhat to himself for the sake of everybody else, there are moments, such as when he tears up at seeing a picture of a complete family, where his fresh pain is pretty damn visible. Perhaps the most telling part of this comes in the somewhat unfortunately short song, where Greg sings about discovering that the beauty of the cyclical nature of life, as described by Rose, isn't quite as beautiful on the other side. Despite the fact that this last Greg flashback ends with him and the gems deciding to work together to raise Steven in the wake of Rose's passing, by the time that we get to his first appearance in the show, Laser Light Cannon, they're more or less back to just pretending that he doesn't really exist. Speaking of that first Greg episode, while most of this quarter hour is spent just introducing the character, we do get the first example of the series-long theme of him preferring to think of Rose as something besides an ultra-important galactic figure, something that stretches all the way back to when she was still alive. And while this usually reveals itself in him declaring that he just doesn't know anything about gem stuff, there are 2 different Greg monologues about this topic that I think are worth doing a deeper dive into. The first of which coming in Steven's dream, when asked by his son about Rose's involvement in the shattering of Pink Diamond, and the second of which being much shorter and coming in the question, when talking to Steven about the fact that Rose was Pink Diamond. In both cases, there's a sense of nonchalance about the historical messiness of his child's mother within Greg, as if it didn't terribly matter what kind of stuff she was into before they met. Something that I've always really appreciated here is how they compare Greg's past as Gregory DeMeo to Rose's past as Pink Diamond. As while there is obviously a bit of a significant difference of significance, the idea that these 2 characters could have only met each other once they have, as Rose described, reinvented themselves, kind of perfectly fits with everything else that we already know about the pair. Even though there aren't a ton of groundbreaking episodes where we get in-depth looks at how Greg feels about Rose in the modern day, as even episodes like Maximum Capacity and Mr. Greg are mostly about the gems and less about him, these 2 moments where he's forced to reconcile what he had with Rose with all of her messed up history easily provide one of the most interesting looks that we get at the character. Ultimately though, Greg tells his son that nothing he learns now can really impact the relationship that he still mourns, as he didn't fall in love with Pink Diamond, he fell in love with Rose Quartz. While there are other episodes that deal with Greg having to face the consequences of effectively taking Rose away from her team, namely Mr. Greg and Maximum Capacity, I think talking about those at length would somewhat take away from what the show is actually trying to say about this pair, which is the idea that, despite everything, and because of everything, these two people from completely different backgrounds loved each other enough to create the show's title character, even knowing the immense consequences that were to come. And while we'll get back to Greg in a second, that last point does bring me to something that somewhat tangentially fits in this video, which is a broader discussion of why Rose chose to create Steven, even knowing both the immediate cost and the challenges that he likely face. And while you could make the argument that Rose knew that the diamonds were coming back, and that only somebody who both had Pink Diamond's gem and wasn't Rose Quartz could convince them to do something besides use their immense power to wreck everything that she had built, I think that kind of defeats the stated purpose that she gave, to give a being a completely unique experience. And even if the show, and especially Pearl, do make it more than clear that Greg wasn't the first human that Rose had relations with, it's not random that it was Greg that she decided to give up her physical form for. And while it seems kind of intuitive here to point out that Greg is the epitome of the ability to change and grow up that Rose monologued about, the show actually makes it pretty clear that the pair never talked about pre-Mr. Universe Greg, and she also obviously didn't know about the adaptation he'd make upon becoming a dad. I think the better reason for why she ended up choosing Greg comes back to their conversation at the end of We Need to Talk, where for the first time, she's almost able to see a human being as an equal. Greg was the first of Rose's flings to put in the work and actually try to build something past the surface level. And while we unfortunately don't get to see much of it, Greg describes this as being the first of a bunch of real conversations between the pair, something that Rose had never had with somebody who wasn't essentially forced to love her. While their relationship might have started with Greg looking up to Rose in more ways than one, it's not hard to see that she's the one doing the bulk of the admiring by the end, something that makes her ultimate decision a bit more understandable. So while you can come up with a litany of explanations for why Rose might have chosen to create Steven, from tactical purposes to just wanting to run from her problems, I think the show's pretty clear as presenting it as the ultimate declaration of her love for humanity, and there's no human, or being for that matter, that she ever loved nearly as much as she loved Greg. Anyway, that's about it for me. Sorry that this one took a bit longer than I expected/promised, but I kept struggling to get it structured in a way that made sense, and then I had COVID, so hopefully it just kind of worked out. If you want to hear more up-to-date excuses for why videos aren't coming out, or just want to see more banger tweets like this one, you can find my Twitter hidden somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in what will probably be like a month with my most requested video yet. Thanks for watching.